What would heaven be for someone who has never seen? Blind from birth, Vicky and Brad each separately discover their version of heaven, years and continents apart. Vicky Umapeg was born prematurely, having been in the womb only 22 weeks at delivery and weighed just 3 pounds at birth. Afterward, her weight dropped precariously to 1 pound, 14 ounces. As was common for premature babies in the 1950s, she was placed in an airlock incubator through which oxygen was administered. Unfortunately, because of a failure to regulate the concentration of oxygen properly, Vicky was given too much, and along with 50,000 other premature babies born in the United States about the same time, suffered such severe optic nerve damage in both eyes as to leave her completely blind. Vicky was not only unable to see light or shadows, even in her dreams, but she was also unable to even understand the concept of light. Because of this, Vicky had never had any visual experience whatsoever until she was 22 years old and seriously injured in an automobile accident. In early 1973, Vicky was working as an occasional singer in a nightclub in Seattle. One night at closing time, circumstances forced her to get a ride to her home with a couple of inebriated patrons. Not surprisingly, a serious accident ensued, during which Vicky was thrown out of their van. Her injuries were extensive and life-threatening, including a skull fracture, concussion, and damage to her neck, back, and one leg. In fact, it took her a full year after being released from the hospital before she could stand upright. Vicky has no memory of her trip to Harborview Hospital in the ambulance, but after she arrived at the emergency room, she found herself up on the ceiling, seeing doctors and nurses working on a body beneath her. To be able to see for the first time in her life was initially frightening to her. She was only used to living by taste, touch, sound, and smell. Then she noticed the unusual wedding ring on the finger of the body below her and realized that it was her body, quite tall and thin at that time. After she realized that she was up on the ceiling, she thought, well, that's kind of weird. What am I doing up here? Am I dead? Vicky could hear one doctor saying to another that she could become deaf as well as blind because she had blood on both eardrums. She tried desperately to communicate to them that she was fine, but drew no response. Almost immediately after that, as she recalls, she found herself going up through the ceilings of the hospital until she was above the roof of the building itself, during which time she had a brief panoramic view of her surroundings. She felt very exhilarated during this ascension and enjoyed tremendously the freedom of movement she was experiencing. She also began to hear beautiful and exquisitely harmonious music, akin to the sound of wind chimes. With scarcely a noticeable transition, she then discovered she had been sucked headfirst into a tube and felt that she was being pulled into it. The enclosure itself was dark, Vicky said, yet she was aware that she was moving toward light. As she reached the opening of the tube, she then rolled out to find herself lying on grass. She was surrounded by trees and flowers and a vast number of people. She was in a place of tremendous light, and the light, Vicky said, was something you could feel as well as see. What the light conveyed was love. Even the people she saw were bright and reflected the light of this love. Everybody there was made of light, and I was made of light. There was love everywhere. It was like love came from the grass, from the birds, from the trees. Vicky then became aware of 5 specific persons she had known who were welcoming her to this place. Debbie and Diane were Vicky's blind schoolmates who had died years before, at ages 11 and 6 respectively. In life, they had both been profoundly retarded as well as blind, but here they appeared bright and beautiful, healthy and vitally alive, and no longer children, but in their prime. In addition, Vicky reports seeing 2 of her childhood caretakers, Mr. and Mrs. Zilk, both of whom had also previously died. Finally, there was Vicky's grandmother, who had essentially raised Vicky and who had just died 2 years before Vicky's accident. Her grandmother reached out to hug Vicky. In these encounters, no actual words were exchanged, Vicky says, but only feelings of love and welcome. In the midst of this rapture, Vicky was suddenly overcome with a sense of total knowledge. I had a feeling like I knew everything, and like everything made sense. I just knew that this was where I would find the answers to all my questions about life and about the universe, God, and everything. It's like the place was the knowing. And then she was indeed flooded with information of a religious nature, as well as scientific and mathematical knowledge. She came to understand languages she didn't know. All this overwhelmed and astonished her. I didn't know beans about math and science, but all of a sudden I understood intuitively things about calculus, about the way planets were made. I felt there was nothing I didn't know. As these revelations were unfolding, Vicky noticed someone next to her, a radiant figure, who greeted her tenderly, while she conveyed her excitement to him about her newfound omniscience and her joy at being there. Then, without speaking, he communicated to her, "Isn't it wonderful? Everything is beautiful here and it fits together. And you'll find that. But you can't stay here now. It's not your time to be here yet, and you have to go back." Vicky reacted, understandably enough, with extreme disappointment and protested, "No, I want to stay with you." But the being reassured her that she would come back, but for now she had to go back and learn and teach more about loving and forgiving. Still resistant, however, Vicky then learned that she also needed to go back to have her children. With that, Vicky, who was then childless, but who desperately wanted to have children, and who has since given birth to 3, became almost eager to return. However, before Vicky could leave, the being said to her in these exact words, "But first, watch this." She then saw a complete panoramic review of her life, and as she watched, the being gently explained the significance of her actions and the repercussions. The last thing Vicky remembers, once the life review had been completed, are the words, "You have to leave now." She then experienced a sickening thud, like a roller coaster going backwards, and found herself back in her body, feeling heavy and full of pain. When Vicky awoke in the hospital, she was again completely blind. The following case is that of Brad Barrows, a 33-year-old man living in Connecticut, who had a near-death experience in the winter of 1968 when he was only 8 years old. Brad, like Vicky, has been blind from birth. At the same time, he was a student at the Boston Center for Blind Children and had contracted a severe case of pneumonia and eventually had severe breathing difficulties. Afterward, he was told by nurses that his heart had stopped, apparently for at least 4 minutes, and that cardiopulmonary resuscitation, or CPR, had been necessary to bring him back. Brad remembers that when he couldn't breathe any longer, he felt himself lifting up from the bed and floating through the room toward the ceiling. He saw his apparently lifeless body on the bed. He also saw his blind roommate get up from his bed and leave the room to get help. His roommate later confirmed this. He then found himself rapidly going upward through the ceilings of the building until he was above the roof. Brad estimates that it was about 7 a.m. when this happened. He noticed that the sky was cloudy and dark. There had been a snowstorm the day before, and Brad could see snow everywhere, except for the streets, which had been plowed. He was able to give a very detailed description of the way the snow looked. He could also see the snowbanks that the plows had created. He saw a streetcar go by. Finally, he recognized a playground used by the children of his school and a particularly hill he used to climb nearby. When Brad was asked if he knew or saw these things, he said, "I clearly visualized them. I remember being able to see quite clearly." After this segment of this experience, which happened very fast, was over, he found himself in a tunnel and emerged from it to find himself in an immense field, illuminated by tremendous, all-encompassing light. Everything was perfect. Brad could clearly see in this domain, too, though he commented that he was puzzled by the sensation of sight. He found himself walking on a path surrounded by tall grass, and also reported seeing tall trees with immense leaves. No shadows were visible, however. While in this field, Brad became aware of beautiful music, like nothing he had ever heard on Earth. Walking toward the sound, he came to and climbed a hill, eventually encountering a glittering stone structure, so brilliant that he thought it might be burning hot. But it wasn't, and he entered it. Brad encountered a man whom he didn't recognize, but who emanated an overwhelming love. The man, without a word, gently nudged Brad backward, initiating a reversal of his experience, ending with his finding himself in bed, gasping for air. He again was completely blind. These two cases took place a continent apart, and before the advent of modern near-death studies.